Okay, David, we are recording and let's get going.
Right. Good morning, everybody. Good to see you all. Still in 2 dimensions. I think we'll be seeing each other in 3 dimensions soon. And I know we will all look forward to that, though we may still continue to have 2-dimension meetings on a regular basis since it is such a carbon footprint friendly approach to meetings. So welcome to the Baycan regional meeting. We do 4 of these a year. We have a very packed agenda. I am David Bihar. I'm the Climate Program Director at the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission and the chair of the Baycan Steering Committee. I'm the MC for today. I want to recognize that Yeshi Sauls, our program director, is not with us today. She had a loss in the family and she's taking personal time right now. Our thoughts are with her. We're going to miss her today. Sarah's going to step in on a lot of the equity agenda items that we have today, and we look forward to Yeshi's return soon. I want to introduce 2 new members that I know of, and let me know if I miss anybody. We have Bill Keene from Climate Equity Solutions. Bill, wave virtually wherever you are. It's hard to see when there's so many, but Bill's here, welcome, a new member. And then we have a returning member, the Hayward Area Shoreline Planning Agency, or HASPA. I saw Eric Pearson here with us earlier. I know he's here. Welcome back, Eric. We're going to be talking about your project, I hope, soon. It's incredible what's happening in HASPA and on the Hayward shoreline on sea level rise and other issues. So welcome back. Am I missing anyone from either of the 2 new members or a new member that I missed who wants to introduce selves now? Seeing none, we may have some new people who are considering being members as well. I want to say, I'll try to say it again, if you are new to Baycan, please put your name and rank and serial number in the chat and your email address so we know to ensure that you're kept informed about what's happening in Baycan stuff. And I want to now ask Bruce to give us an overview of the agenda as we gather now over 50 people. Bruce.
Great, thanks, David. And let me advance the slide. So we have a great agenda today. We're featuring 2 fabulous speakers, Ami Raval from APEN on just resilience and recovery, and Sarah Church, our vice chair from Baycan, is going to lead that whole section. There'll be breakouts after Ami's talk. And the second key speaker that we're going to have today is Daniel Swain from UCLA and NCAR. He's going to talk about the latest research on heat and drought and fire. I will lead that section. We will have breakouts with that big topic as well. We're also going to talk about, as you can see on the screen, our new and expanded Baycan program for year 4, 21-22. We'll talk about that in just a minute. We're going to report on some great new interesting legislation and some prospects of actual money for adaptation from Sacramento and also from our nation's capital. We're going to get to all of you for some adaptation and resilience news. We'll hear Bay Adapt and we'll hear some other updates. We would ask that you put your updates and announcements in the chat box again so we can record them as we go. And then we'll finish off today. David is going to lead a section on a new proposal that we have for a climate science services program for the Bay Area. So that is our agenda. We're slated to go 9 to noon, and we'll have a break, short break at 10:30 for everybody to get up and stretch and all. So that is our agenda.
Great. Thanks, Bruce. So let's launch into agenda item 1, which is kind of Baycan planning for the year. It starts with membership renewals and new member recruitment, which we're in right now. everybody, all of the key contacts for each organization, we don't send it to everybody who attends a meeting, but the key contact for each member should have gotten a 3-pager that includes an overview of what Baycan is about, an overview of the program that we're about to review now, some nice pictures, and some testimonials from members of Baycan talking about what they've gotten out of it over time. And so this is in your inbox. If you're a key contact, you should know who you are. If for any reason you're not sure, contact us. And then an invoice came on April 21st. This is what it looks like. People sometimes look for Bruce's name or look for Baycan, but what you need to look for is Local Government Commission. That's how the invoices come in. LGC. This is mine on April 21st for City and County of San Francisco. So look that up. If for any reason you don't see it, you can't find it, you're a member and it hasn't been forwarded on to your invoice department or whoever it is, please let us know. Any questions about membership renewals? I want to say, if you're thinking of one, that I should put participants up in case hands come up. Yes, I see one. Good. So I'll call on you, Paloma, in 1 second. I also want to say that we're doing new member recruitment, and we might ask folks for some help and thoughts on that because that's an important part of how we can expand the influence and the linking of best practices across the Bay Area. So Paloma, did you have a hand up or did you take it down? Or go ahead.
Yes, I took it down. Just wanted to welcome several members of our Gaia intern team that are here today.
Very good. Thank you. What's Gaia? Tell me, remind me.
Gaia is our leadership academy at Earth House Center. Living body of Earth, living systems. We integrate both environmental scientific studies along with leadership development tools. And we're thrilled to have, this year we've had 18 members in our Leadership Academy, and several of them have been participating here at Baycan. And this is our emerging leaders of the future. So we're thrilled to be in this intergenerational learning space and sharing it with Baycan.
Fantastic. Thank you, Paloma, and welcome to all the young people who are going to solve these problems that we have all been contributing to, not counting any of you young people who haven't contributed as much yet. All right, so here's the program overview. And I want to ask Bruce to kind of introduce this item and give an overview, and then we'll go into discussing it in some detail.
Great, and we have a hand up from Danielle.
Sorry, thank you, Danielle.
Oh, no, just quickly, I was curious if you wanted our thoughts on recruiting new members, or maybe after this program plan.
Offline, okay?
Great.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you. We will be asking for your help. So, we're turning 4. Baycan is on July 1. So we've learned a lot, I think, in working with you all over the first 3 years here. So we've got a new and expanded program proposed here for the 21-22 year starting July 1. We think that there'll be more direct benefits for you, our members, our paying members. And we think that the new and expanded program will help with our contribution to a more equitable climate adaptation and resilience planning space in the Bay Area. So that's why we're beefing things up and all for 21-22. And now David and Sarah and I are gonna run through kind of the particulars of the new program.
Yeah, great. So I'll just highlight the objectives at the top, and then we'll start talking about things individually. We have learned over the past 3+ years, as Bruce said, and the goal of these objectives is within our means, respond to the urgency and activity that's going on in regional climate adaptation, respond to member demand for information and networking and development. We've seen the way benefits have been created for individual members. We want to continue to expand those benefits, expand the collaborative framework, expand the sharing of leading practices, and the advancement of the practice of adaptation and the practice of equitable adaptation through Baycan's work. So that's what this program is for this year coming up, or next year coming up, intended to take on. And then of course to build on our success to date where feasible. So we have a fairly limited budget. I didn't mention this. Our budget is entirely from our members. So membership renewals, new members, et cetera, is the key to allowing us to continue to do all this work. We're in good financial shape, and we've maintained good financial shape even during the COVID-related downturn. And if we can keep that up, we'll be able to do continue to do this work and expand it over time. So we have divided into 3 columns: member services, programs, and learning networks, kind of the kinds of things that we've been doing. Bruce leads all of our programs, but I want to ask him to kind of talk about the member services column first.
Great, and thanks, David. In column 1 here, these are things you're pretty familiar with. We are going to continue in year 4 to hold these quarterly half-day Zoom meetings. We'll see if we get to a point where we could have maybe 1 in-person meeting each year. But I think the Zoom approach, while it was put onto us, has worked quite well. So we'll continue that, the usual mix in these meetings of bringing in experts as we're doing today, and lots of time for you to network and learn from each other, kind of 2 parts. We're going to step up our consultations, which is the next box down, so that we do it on a more proactive basis, that we are contacting each of you quarterly by Zoom or phone to check in. What are your immediate needs? How can we help? What kinds of referrals can we give you? So we're going to be doing more. Yeshi and I will be doing this primarily on the personal consultation side of the house. And we're going to look at our resource hub. Yeshi manages the resource hub now with the baycanadapt.org and the monthly newsletter, and we have the project matrix map. We're going to be looking at each of those to see how we can make them even bigger and better for you, really targeted for the new year. So that's that first column, David.
Sorry, muted. Okay. So we've had, the first thing we did in terms of going beyond the regional and sub-regional meetings that we had with Baycan was to really start an equity work group that Yeshi, Phoenix, Nahal led, but had tremendous leadership from the community as well, from across the Bay Area. And I'm going to turn it to Sarah now to talk about how that work group is really being expanded into a program next year.
Yeah, thanks, David. So of course, Yeshi will share more about her broad vision for this in coming meetings, but we want to expand the work that's been happening within the working group to be a whole equity program that kind of permeates the organization. You can hear it reflected in how Bruce and David have been talking about our work. And we've started some of this, but we're going to codify it. We want to embed equity throughout the organization, within the consultations, within the resources we share. We want to look at procedural equity within the structures of Baycan, our trainings, our ongoing, community of practice within the working group and outside of it. So allowing equity to be a full part of all the work we do. And I'll pass it back to David. And okay. Stay tuned for more, and you can always participate in our working group to get the most concentrated equity work. Great.
Thanks, Sarah. I think that this is really helping. It has helped set the tone for thinking broadly about impacts of adaptation, particularly on most vulnerable communities. And, this is entirely consistent with what's happening at a state and even a national level now. I think that we're part of that effort, and that's obviously extremely important. Climate Science Services is a program that Bruce and I have talked about for probably 10 years as a need. And I'm going to go into it in much greater detail at the very end of the agenda, so please stick around for that. The idea is that a lot of adaptation work starts with the science. It never ends with the science, but it is a key input, and having an ability to translate this information for practical use by all of you who are on this call is an important part of what collaboration in service of adaptation is about. And we'll talk a lot more about that on that agenda item coming at the end of today's meeting. State government engagement next. Bruce, I want to ask you to kind of give a quick overview of that, though that's an agenda item too.
Yeah, we will see this one in a few minutes later this morning when we talk about some of the legislation in Sacramento that we're not just following now, but actually working on. You'll see there's a lot more interest in Sacramento and obviously certainly in Washington, D.C. as well in climate adaptation and resilience. So we are planning for year 4 here to up our game and do more with advocacy on behalf of Baycan and ARCA in Sacramento, particularly around funding for adaptation and supported programs. So that's that one. We'll hear more about the current news on state government engagement in a little bit.
Great. Okay, so handing it back to Sarah now for the next 2 items under our learning networks. Obviously, a big part of what we do is acting as a network, and we're looking to expand that work and define it really well coming up next year. So Sarah, why don't you provide an overview of the next 2 items?
Sure. So under learning networks, we're really interested in starting a pilot of peer-to-peer networking because one of the things we've heard from members time and again is that you get a lot of out of the connections with one another through the network. And these all region meetings are great, for conveying information, but the smaller groups can facilitate some more of that connection. So Zoom meetings have shown us that, we can do smaller meetings. They don't have to be geographically based or based on sub-region. We can do them based on similar function or, other ways of grouping our membership. So our 2 pilots that bubbled up from interest from the membership are going to be peer-to-peer groupings around water districts and counties. And I know, speaking as a county, we have a lot of similarities with other counties and resources to share, so we're really excited about it. If you're in one of these groups, keep your eye out for more information about that peer-to-peer network. And the next item, emerging hot topics. So sometimes in our field, everybody's attention snaps to a certain topic, like when the skies are orange, for example. And so right now we're gearing up for wildfire season, and we know that there are some needs within our members for that kind of focus on hot topics. Hopefully the pun is not always apropos. So this is going to help us zero in on those and focus the attentions of the network. And as useful, we'll kind of figure out what's needed. Maybe it's webinars, discussions, strategy sessions, ways to convene. And we also hope that this in particular is going to be a way to reach beyond the quote unquote usual climate suspects. Many of you come from organizations that might even have thousands of staff, right, in all these different roles. There's a lot of different ways that adaptation and resilience should be looking across our organizations in all the agencies or all the departments. And so we want to be able to, for example, if we're zeroing in on a topic that might be of real interest to emergency services staff or health staff, that might be an opportunity for them to come, whereas something like the regional meeting wouldn't center on their topic. So this is going to be ad hoc. It'll take a lot of forms. And if you'd like to lead one, or you have content to share on one, let us know in the chat, start the conversation rolling. And if you have something to offer on wildfire, we will be thinking about that coming up. So please share that in the chat as well. And I'll pass back to David.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. Comments, questions on the program are welcome. I also want to mention, while anyone is thinking about that, you can raise your hand in the chat function, or no, it's in the participant function, isn't it? Where is the raise hand? No, yeah, participant. I also want to preview that there is a section later on for Bay Area adaptation and resilience news, which includes member and partner news. If anyone wants to bring any news on things they're working on in that section, that'll be at 10 after the 10:15 agenda, during the 10:15 agenda item. So any questions or comments about the work plan from anybody? All crystal clear. Okay. So
hello? Can you hear me?
yes, who is that?
This this is Carl Anthony.
Hi, Carl.
We've been following this process, and we've been at some disadvantage, and we have been very much concerned with getting large numbers of people from disadvantaged communities in these conversations, and we have not been able to get the process that you are working to make it work at the scale that it needs to. And I'm wondering if the equity working group has been able to get that scale. And if not, then I think we need to make a drastic change.
Great and fair question, Carl. Let me ask Sarah if she wants to talk about that, because she was just at the equity work group meeting that was last week, and I was not able to join that one.
Yeah, and Carl was there as well. Good to be with you, Carl. I take that to heart. I think there's a lot more that we can do with the equity working group space and with the equity work in the network generally. And we've really appreciated your leadership and participation in helping to shape what that looks like. And we'll continue to do that. And we welcome you and all others who are in the broader network but haven't joined us for equity working group. We really would like to scale this up. So we can talk a little more offline about your ideas on that. I know you've shared many of them, and look forward to doing more.
We had asked to be on that in the equity working group, and we were told it was full. So we may have missed a great deal that has been done. But
I'm not sure we've ever said it was full. Well, I don't know why we would say that. Everyone is always invited. More the better.
Yeah, and we've really appreciated your participation and had a number of participants from Breakthrough Communities at the meeting last week, for example. And so, yeah, if there are ways we could remove more barriers, we can keep talking about that.
I also think, Carl, that a lot of the programs were sorry, just
talking with you about this offline, but we're very concerned that the levels of participation seems to be far too low.
Well, we certainly need to do a stellar job of that. And if we're not yet, then I think the expansion of the equity work group into a broader program, as well as some of these other things that we're launching next year, hot topics, peer-to-peer networks, and the climate science services program as well, will offer avenues for participation. That's not sufficient, we know, but they will define opportunities. So let's be sure that we're doing everything we can to encourage as much engagement as we can. Okay, so thank you, Carl.
A raised hand?
Do we have a raised hand?
Yes. Karina Lopez.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to comment. I don't know the particulars of the group working on this issue. However, one of the ideas that I think could be explored is that, engagement of youth of color. And I know here in San Leandro, we have a social justice academy. And so when there's the intersectionality of social justice and environmental justice, there's an opportunity there. And I think engaging maybe, some of the teachers and involving youth and understanding that the intersectionality would be fruitful. And I believe that there is curriculum, social justice curriculums, at least in our school district here, but I believe that they are in the other school districts in the area. And so perhaps, seeing and looking to collaborate with those teachers, because they're perceived as trusted messengers within the community, might be an avenue. Certainly, if we're not looking at peer-to-peer in terms of our own sort of age group demographic, and I'm kind of looking around, I think I'm not the only one with gray hair here, who is middle aged, but also, I think it's also wise to build a bench, so to speak. And that's where it happens. I think that there's an opportunity there, and that could be looked at. And I don't know if that's being looked at already, but I wanted to offer it up as an idea. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Karina, for that comment. And it's something we've discussed quite a bit in the equity working group. And I just had a light bulb about a potential to either highlight or particularly welcome young people to participate. And that's something we would want to do in a way that made sense and was appropriate and really welcomed their leadership. So we want to think carefully about it. But I know having breakthrough communities, they do a lot of important work in that sphere, and it's certainly something that we want to think about how we can engage youth. So thank you.
Yeah, I mean, you just have to basically meet. You have to basically meet people where they are, right? So
Yes.
I mean, if you're looking at having inclusion in this conversation, then that is how you do it. I think you just have to go out into the field itself, rather than sort of anticipating that people would come here to a meeting that's 3 hours in the middle of the day during the middle of the week. And I think that can be done, and with just again engaging some of those trusted messengers in communities, which are primarily, I think, some of our public school teachers. Thanks.
Yeah, we have, we've done some things, and I think we need to do some more things. One of the things we've done is that community-based organizations are free to join Baycan, and members of the CBOs who participate in meetings are compensated for their time when they submit invoices for that purpose. That's not going to be enough necessarily, but it's steps forward. I'm also looking at Jessica Fain from BCDC, because we've had these same conversations within the BayAdapt process in terms of education, engaging youth, communities of color in general, but young people in particular, which is not something that Baycan has a particular strength in. And I think we can collectively do a better job. And Jessica might touch on that when we hear about BayAdapt later in the agenda.
Hey, you found something. An
Sorry?
earring. Oh my God. Oh, I am so
Paloma?
thrilled. Yes.
Sorry, we can hear you. Are you speaking to us?
Sorry. No, sorry.
Okay. All right. So let's continue this conversation. It will be continued. We're perhaps going to continue it now on the next item, which I want to introduce Sarah to bring us to our keynote speaker on this very subject next.
Yeah, thanks, David. And we have a great keynote speaker today who's going to pick up on a lot of these themes that we've been discussing. I just want to note how alive these conversations are around not only the importance of integrating equity and community voices into our network, but the how of how to make that work. And then, what the work that our equity working group has been contending with, which is how can we build equitable resilience? And that's, it's a giant challenge. It's something we're working on. And I think us and, around the world, we're all learning how to do this work. And I also want to bring in another thread that, I know is on all our minds right now, which is that we are asking this question about how to build equitable resilience in the context of a global pandemic. And a global pandemic that is disproportionately impacting frontline communities of color, both in the health impacts and in the economic impacts. So this is having a huge impact on our community. And yet we want to keep having the conversation about equitable resilience. We want to make sure that that we're integrating with what's really needed right now in people in their communities are facing in the lives of everyone in our geographic area that we serve here in the 9-county area. So we've been looking in the equity working group at the intersection of equity, resilience, and the impact of COVID-19 on our communities. What does it mean to build climate resilience in a pandemic? Could our strategies to build resilience be integrated with those, to combat the virus, to both respond to and recover rather than being at odds? And how can all of these efforts be truly equitable and just and co-creating with and really listening to the needs of community? So lots of questions, not a lot of answers yet, but I'm so pleased to introduce Ami Raval, Research Director of Asian Pacific Environmental Network, who will be our keynote and is going to address some of these issues and pick up on some of these themes, share wisdom with us. And APEN, if you haven't heard of the organization, has just led at the front lines of environmental justice, just transition, resilience work embedded in Asian immigrant and refugee community here in the Bay Area. And AMI has been a pioneer and a thought leader of this work, championing and elevating community voices throughout, all the way up to the state level, and presenting frameworks around mapping and data, and this work around just recovery that we're going to focus on, and a lot more. So AMI's ideas and research are at the core of some really exciting initiatives and policy coming out of the governor's office, and in some proposed legislation that she'll touch on and we'll talk a little more about. And of course, we're very pleased to have it right here in this meeting. So I want to pass things off to Ami. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Sarah. I'm going to share my screen. Can folks see that?
Yes.
Yep.
And let me just make sure, and you see it moving. 1 second.
Don't see it moving yet.
1 second.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm gonna. Now?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
great. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me today to share a little bit about APEN's work around building community resilience to climate change. Just to give a little bit of background on who APEN is, we're a grassroots space building organization. We organize, as Sarah mentioned, working class, Asian, immigrant, and refugee communities across a multitude of environmental justice issues. We were formed after the first People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit in 1991 and have been doing community work for over 25 years. So just to share kind of the broad strategies, a fundamental part of our work is local organizing and building community power, and really amplifying the voices of our community members as the decision makers for the programs and policies in their communities. So that foundationally means local organizing and leadership development, specifically with Southeast Asian refugee communities in Richmond, where our members live on the fence line of the Chevron refinery and have been fighting for just transition for decades, and also Chinese immigrant communities in Oakland, Chinatown. And this is really the foundation of our work, as I mentioned. We're also building political power through statewide coalition building and electoral organizing, where we're doing targeted voter outreach with Asian voters across California. And then we finally do policy advocacy, both locally and at the state level. And that's kind of the realm of work that I'll be sharing a little bit more about. But of course, all of our policy work, all of our strategies are grounded in the community organizing work that we do. So this picture should, be familiar from last summer when we had the apocalyptic sky. We know the way that California is being pushed to extremes, and the record heat, fire, and pollution all have one thing in common. They are being made worse by climate change. And this convergence is the strongest signal yet for us that the climate crisis isn't far off in the future. It's here today, more intense than ever. And I uplift these quotes because scientists say we've lost complete control, that there isn't a normal anymore. And that when you add all these crises together, the impact is cumulative. But what I want to raise is that for environmental justice communities that have been plagued with the burden from polluting industries for generations, there's actually nothing new about cumulative health impacts. However, in this moment, from our perspectives, we're seeing traditional models for crisis response proving deeply inadequate. They might be coordinated through militarized entities like sheriff departments. They rely upon protocols that mean you need a car to evacuate to a faraway site. They share alerts in maybe 1 to 2 languages. And some shelters might require people to present identification to access services. So these types of policies are collectively shutting out many, many people from the support that they need. And I want to focus in, since folks here are working in the Bay Area, just really hone in on that. On the 3rd week of August last summer, if folks remember, we talk a lot about sort of cascading disasters and cumulative impacts. And I think that weekend just paints that picture again of what our communities are experiencing. We saw that at the start of that weekend, the Bay Area hit record temperature highs in an intense extreme heat wave. That weekend, we saw rolling power outages that led to a failure at the wastewater treatment plant in West Oakland, which polluted the bay with 50,000 gallons of sewage, which prevented folks from cooling off in the water because there were advisories at the beach. Simultaneously in Richmond, where our community, as I mentioned, folks are living near the Chevron refinery, there was flaring there at the refinery that sent black smoke above the area and forced families to close their windows amidst the plume of black smoke. That weekend wrapped up with a rare lightning storm that started an early wildfire season and led to the month of relentless poor air quality. And then at the end of September, we were kind of bombarded by that sequence of smoke, heat, and smog. And so these are just some of the stories and lived experiences that we're confronting, at the worst sort of moments at the convergence of these crises. But you can see the way that EJ communities, right, are disproportionately impacted, are experiencing a unique set of threats due to some of the, again, cascading impacts based on where they live. So this context setting really pushes us to talk, we've been really pushing in this moment and demanding a just recovery, that the time has come to make long-term and deep investments in the resilience of the communities that have the least material resources. And we know these commitments take leadership with tight budgets. We thought maybe before, I think, what we see in the state budget now, which in fact is a surplus, we thought there might be pressure to revert to austerity, to cut public expenses and worsen the conditions that have severely weakened the social safety net. And instead, when we talk about a just recovery in the midst of growing economic inequality, the COVID-19 pandemic, historic climate disasters like those I just uplifted, alongside racial injustice, sort of the confluence of these multiple crises in our communities, we're pushing the state to do the opposite. We're pushing the state to recover through ambitious investments in communities, in public services, and high road jobs to really repair the legacy of injustice in our communities. So I was asked to share sort of amidst sort of all of this last year, spring, when shelter in place guidance isn't put in place, we were in lockdown. Amidst all these crises, APEN with our partners, including the Green Lining Institute, Scope in Southern California that organizes in LA, as well as California Relief, we kind of worked together to create a set of recommendations for what a just COVID response and recovery meant and looked like. And it was very much rapid response. But I wanted to highlight, we had over 100 organizations sign on as it became an organizing tool. But it was a moment for us to uplift the immediate needs of our communities amidst the intensifying pandemic, to inform sort of immediate state decision-making and resource distribution. And so we offered a discrete set of policy recommendations and built a coalition alongside that we've continued to be able to engage. The kind of areas that we pushed, and I'm happy to share the link to the letter in the chat after the talk, but these are just a sampling. There was a rich set but the three were making equity real in COVID response efforts. So at the time, we were really thinking about it being an election year and making sure folks had multiple ways to vote and that was safe and accessible. And another one we pushed, a recommendation was establishing a statewide office of racial equity, which is actually legislation that's moving this year. So I uplift that because a lot of this became a blueprint for multi-year policy strategies. And that proposal, the Greenlining Institute with partners is pushing right now. We also pushed for a set of recommendations around strategic investments for green stimulus. And so really uplifted that nexus between climate change and COVID recovery, and thinking about access to free transit or sort of creation of community resilience hubs, which I'll talk about. And then the last one was achieving economic resilience and recovery, and really uplifted the need for debt relief, included across housing and utilities, as well as workforce protections for our most vulnerable, including domestic workers, farm workers, and I'll share a little bit more about that one too. So before I dive into a few kind of solutions we're working on, I often share this slide just to uplift for us, what does a resilient community look like? And I invite folks to take a look at this image. I think there's a multitude of things we want to see, from clean energy, like solar and storage and microgrids for backup power, access to green space to protect folks from extreme heat and flooding, clean air, healthy food, supportive neighbors and support systems, as well as a safe and affordable place to live, and much more. But I also invite folks to take a look on the image on the right from our some of our national partners that uplifts. It takes roots to weather the storm. To achieve this vision for resilient communities, we have to do more than strengthen built infrastructure and the natural environment. And folks may be tracking the conversation federally around what does infrastructure mean. And while we know that protecting natural resources and hardening of infrastructure is important to building resilience, we have to also prioritize people and communities, particularly the most impacted communities, working class communities of color, in the face of all of the crises we're experiencing. And so our vision is really about centering neighborhoods and people and preparing them to be able to cope with climate disasters, as well as build resilience every day. And I do want to uplift that there is a role for resilience amidst this moment, in that our communities have had to be incredibly resilient. So this isn't necessarily a new concept amidst historic disinvestment and deep systemic failures. And so we've seen over the past year, especially, again, not new, that our communities are organizing for change, and they're innovating local models for crisis response. In some places, neighbors have formed mutual aid networks to share resources. Schools are providing food to families through the pandemic, and libraries were turned into cooling and air respite centers when conditions were severe. So to capture a lot of those stories, that expertise in organizing we were seeing last year, last fall, we ended up releasing our Resilience Before Disaster report with SEIU California and Blue Green Alliance, which makes the case for investing in social infrastructure as part of achieving climate resilience. And so we highlight two models, community resilience hubs, as well as sort of resilient workforce development. But to just uplift what social infrastructure really means, we're thinking about investments in public institutions like schools, libraries, park and rec sites, community organizations, whether that be youth and senior centers, places of worship and childcare facilities, small businesses, as well as housing that our communities live in. So that's just like the richness of when we say social infrastructure, this exists often in the neighborhoods that we organize. So I wanted to zoom in and highlight community resilience hubs. We really sort of modeled and adapted the expertise and work nationally for a California context and to sort of shape our work locally. But just to give folks a kind of a definition, community resilience hubs are spaces where communities gather, organize, and access social services, not only during climate disasters or shocks, but every day on a daily basis are meeting the needs of communities. This can mean services like cooling and heating access, electricity, food, water, medical supplies, information and communications access, as well as partner coordination. And so in our report, we uplifted a list of principles on how resilience hubs should be designed. And in addition to, leveraging trusted partners, we talk about community governance and collaboration, workforce development, and targeted benefits. And I'm just going to share one example, which is pictured here, the RISE Youth Center in Richmond, which we right now, APEN is partnering to become a community resilience hub model project where we organize. RISE was an established and trusted community space and really an anchor for Richmond youth to go to access youth programming and services and a community space. So RISE is expanding, it's under construction right now. And as part of that expansion, there was this conversation around wanting to also meet the community's climate resilience needs. So the vision is actually RISE will be installing solar panels and battery storage to provide backup power so that if there is a power outage, folks can go to RISE to charge their phones, to refrigerate food and medicine, and charge important medical devices or other sort of electricity needs. It also will include air filtration and air purifiers to be able to, if there's wildfire smoke days, a clean and safe place for people to go to seek respite. But that's not all. We're actually doing a survey right now in Richmond. APEN has been distributing a youth survey to ask youth in Richmond, what are your needs for climate resilience? And what do you want to see in terms of the services and resources that RISE provides as part of its expansion? So I think the most innovative part of this project is that it's youth-led. And the youth governance model, if there's any savings from the clean energy system, the youth at the RISE Center will get to decide through like an advisory body where that savings could go. And so that ownership piece is really, really important to answer that question of like the how of how these investments are made, in addition to just sort of the resources for the infrastructure. And I'm cognizant of time, so I won't go into this as much, but we did have a whole section in the report around in-home resilience and workforce development and the role of home care workers who are really on the front lines of resilience for some of our most vulnerable, including elderly folks, disabled people, and folks with chronic illnesses. And so again, in times of crisis, those are the folks that we need to make sure have the protections and services they need and are able to, go to the access, where the healthcare if needed. And home care workers are often those, again, on the front line first responders for those community members. We also uplift the role of the public sector workforce, which many of you here represent today, which is key to building social cohesion, whether that be public health nurses, community health workers, social workers, local government staff, librarians, rec center staff. These are all roles in our community that either are staffing places like resilience hubs or public spaces people go to access resources, or are designing planning and resources to address resilience. So we really uplift that there's a workforce development piece here, and training these set of workers to be able to respond during emergencies is actually like an important immediate need to give folks the tools to respond in times of crisis. So I already highlighted RISE here, but just wanted to give you some pictures of the process of what it's kind of looking like. Hopefully it'll be complete at the end of the year. I just wanted to highlight our work in Chinatown is kind of, our focus has been RISE, but we are in the next, hopefully few years, looking at modeling this in Chinatown too. We were unsuccessful in securing funding a few years ago, but some of the sites we were looking at were Lincoln Elementary School and Asian Health Services, which is a pretty culturally important health clinic in Chinatown. So that's more like on the horizon. And then the last thing is that this work continues. We know that projects like RISE and what we want to do in Chinatown for our community takes resources, and we need more of it. And so APEN's actually working on a bill right now with the California Environmental Justice Alliance and NRDC to create more funding through a new grant program for resilience hubs that could fund upgrades like energy efficiency, like clean energy microgrids, like ventilation or air conditioning upgrades, to really achieve and scale these projects across the state, because every community has unique needs. There's no one size fits all model. And while we're demonstrating one project through RISE, we know that there are diverse needs across the state and even within the Bay Area. So that's kind of all I have for folks. And yeah, thank you. I hope this helps as part of your kind of imagining and visioning in the breakouts of how this can apply to the work you all are doing.
Great, thank you so much, Ami. There's so much richness in all the work that you're doing and so much power. Appreciate you bringing that here today. And we would love to have time to have you speak for much longer, but I do want to send the group into breakout so we all get the chance to take in and chew on and think about how could we use this information that's been presented in our own context, in our own organizations. And great, there are the breakout. Thank you, Bruce. There are the breakout questions right there. Also, if you have questions for Ami, you can throw them into the chat right now, but I want to get us into our breakout so everybody gets the chance to really chew on these. So here are the breakout questions, and I'm going to also throw them in the chat so that you can have them when you go into breakouts. If you can designate someone in we want to really capture all the thinking of the network. So I'm throwing both the questions in the chat and also an email address. Thank you, Sophia, for collecting. If someone in the group can take notes and send them to Sophia, then we will we'll kind of collate them, bring them all together and share them back out so we can all be thinking about how to really take these ideas and run with them in our own contexts. Thanks so much, Ami. We're really going to learn a lot from and build on what you shared. So thank you.
Yeah, good luck.
Right, so maybe ready for breakouts.
How long, Sarah, how long are you giving for the breakouts?
Let's see. We can do 12 minutes.
Yes, perfect. Great. We have
Great.
10 groups and we're sending you breakouts now. As Sarah said, the questions here are in the, will be in the chat function. Have fun.
Hi, my name is Zach. I'm supposed to be with the rest of the Breakthrough Communities team in the same room as Carl, I believe. Is there any chance you can get me in there?
Yeah, and I don't see you on the unassigned list. That's how I move you.
I think I was assigned to breakout room 5. I'm not sure how.
And you want to be in, where's Carl? Okay, you're in 5, Zach, and we need to put you in, in 3. Okay, so just give me a second.
No worries. Thank you.
You're in 5. There we are. Move to 3. Yes. Okay.
Hey there, Bruce. Can you hear me?
Hey, Bruce, is everybody down in a workout room or did you guys take a break?
They're in breakouts.
You're on
We're just finishing
mute
though.
or there's no audio. Are you there? Maybe
They're
it's
just
me. Hold on.
they're just finishing breakouts.
Okay. Yeah, my internet went down and we had to recover the whole service over here.
They'll be back in 2 minutes, so just sit tight.
Thanks. And you're recording the whole session, right?
Yes.
Darn it, I clicked the leave breakout room button as soon as it popped up as opposed to waiting 60 more seconds. So everybody is left in the middle of somebody's sentence. Okay, well, that was awful.
That's the way it works.
You know,
Welcome back. Thanks everyone for participating. I want to just check in here that I'm going to repaste the email address. If you were able to take notes in your breakouts, we'd love to hear what you all came up with. And why don't you go ahead, you can also throw right now in the chat any kind of broad takeaways from the conversation so we can all share a little bit with one another right now. Go ahead and throw those in. And I wanted to mention too that the Equity Working Group has been specifically discussing the letter that Ami lifted up that's signed by APEN and Greenlining and California Relief and a number, 100 organizations. It outlines recommendations, as she said, for the governor's office to build equity, recovery, and resilience at the same time, thinking about all those things together. And we've been identifying the recommendations that are also in that letter and in some other resources that are also relevant for local governments so that we can learn from this really important work that's being done and these solutions being presented. So keep your eye out for more on that from the Equity Working Group. And if you're interested to join us in the Equity Working Group, please throw your email address into the chat and I will capture those to share with Yeshi. We are missing her today, but we'll have a lot of notes and things to share with her when she gets back. So thanks again. I don't know if Ami's still with us, but really appreciate her powerful work and presentation. And I'll pass it back.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Ami. That was terrific. I thought our breakouts were always good as always and a little bit on the short side, but I did get some good content out of them. And we will definitely be compiling that. And, I think the, resilience, community resilience is climate resilience. One of the messages I took away from that, and I think we can do a better job as a society in making those linkages and, uplifting communities and the resilience of our entire area. So that's what the equity program and our other programs, which are going to incorporate equitable adaptation planning into them, are going to be about at Baycan going forward. So keeping moving, we're a little bit behind, but not a lot. Latest on legislation and money from Sacramento. It's not unrelated to the subject we just had, but I'm going to give it to Bruce and note that we're going to do this and then some adaptation resilience news. And about midway through the meeting, we will have a 5-minute bio break that's not in the actual schedule, but we'll throw that in about 10:25. Bruce.
Thanks, David. and a great segment. Let me put a plug in also for the chat box on another item. Coming up later, we're going to talk about heat, drought, and fire, and we want to hear in that set of breakouts what your organization is planning on either heat or drought or fire this summer, or on all three. But to capture those, we'd like to have you also write a sentence or two about what your organization is planning or hoping to do in the chat box as we go through the rest of the nearly 2 hours of the meeting. So use the chat box to put those examples of things your organization is planning to do on heat, drought, and fire in the chat box as we go through, like this next item, while I'm talking, so you don't have to totally listen to me. So let me bring the list back up again. Okay, so there is a lot going on in Sacramento in terms of legislation and money around climate adaptation. It has really been a sea change, as they say, in the last couple of years. So I am going to go through quickly just some of the highlights. This is not the entire list. If you want the entire list, go to the ARCA legislative tracker that I'm kind of running my cursor over right here. We'll put that in the chat box as well. They have the complete list. Here are the ones we're focusing on. Certainly AB 897. This is about regional climate adaptation planning, requiring this kind of thing by region. So for the Bay Area or for San Diego or for the Sacramento region, there are probably going to be 10 or 12 regions in the state. This one has a really good chance of passing. So we've been spending time on this one. We think it's a very good set of steps forward. It's not perfect, towards the kind of structure of state, region, and local planning being integrated. We think 897 will help us take a couple of big steps forward with that. It would call for the ocean protection, or not the ocean, the Governor's Office of Planning and Research to set up the regions and guidelines and kind of manage the process. But it's all about regional adaptation planning, building on local planning and local assessments that many of you are doing. Second one, SB1, is about sea level rise and forming something called the California Sea Level Rise State and Regional Support Collaborative. It talks about channeling money through Coastal Commission, maybe through other means to get to, again, local planning, but with some collaborative approach to it. You can find out more about SB1 by looking that one up. AB 585 is an interesting one. Rivas is the author. It's calling for an extreme heat and community resilience program, and it's got things in there about actual projects of cool pavements and cool building materials, cool community design, but also resilience centers, as Ami was talking about and others have talked about, Susan Silver has here. So it's a combo, but all around heat, of actual physical projects and some emergency centers and things like that. AB 1087, Ami talked about, but you'll see it here on the list. Baycan wrote a letter of support for 1087 about creating resilience hubs. There are a number of other bills, but those are the four that we're kind of focused on right now, and we'll keep you informed through the newsletter as we move forward. There are a couple about money, which is very interesting. The AB 1500 is a nearly $7 billion proposed bond issue that would go on the 2022 ballot. So not this year, next year, and would appropriate money through bonds for physical projects. That's mostly what bonds are about. You can do some planning with them, but it's mostly about things. And this would be about supply of water, flood, fire, heat, drought, and there's some workforce elements in the assembly bond. SB 45 is the Senate version of the bond. It's a little less money. It doesn't include heat right now. We also like 1500 better than we like 45 because 1500 has about $1 billion for what they're calling regionally significant projects with multi-benefits. So not kind of dividing everything into the pieces of wildfire, flood, drought, but trying to come up with some projects that work on all of them. What'll happen here as these two bonds move forward is that there'll eventually be a negotiation between the leaders on either of the pieces of legislation, and you'll end up with one proposed bond. So we're hopeful that this will continue because this is really where we get down to it practically. Do we have money to do the kinds of things that we're running now in our adaptation planning processes? Finally, there's going to be a new, much more than the usual May revise budget that kind of tweaks the January budget. The May budget that's coming out next week, we were told, because of the budget surplus, is going to be, frankly, a rather new budget. And we are very hopeful that we'll find, when we see it next week, an adaptation and resilience package. We don't know, and it's out of our hands, obviously, but there will be time after that new budget comes out. There'll be time to work with our legislators who will then negotiate the budget with the Newsom administration. So we, and Warner has been working on this and some others, we will have some news for you after the budget comes out next week, the new budget, and some guidance maybe of where we can put some pressure to make sure some of the things we need are in this new and bigger budget. It's a lot of one-time money, but one-time money can be very helpful in this budget surplus environment that we're in. Finally, the Biden Harris budget proposal in DC, again, proposed to Congress, ups the ante for climate by 14 billion. And it's divided into some of the categories you see here. I'll put a link in the chat box on the what some of the items are here that they're proposing, but it's really quite extensive. It's one of the biggest budget increases that we've seen in any budget category. If you look across the entire, multi-trillion-dollar federal budget proposal. So quite a bit going on. It's really heartening for those of us who've been in this a while, and in particular, and those of you that are new to it. This is not the way it's been. We've been scrounging to get a little bit of legislation and a little bit of funding. We're not out of the woods yet, but we're really making progress because obviously our legislators are seeing the fires, they're seeing the drought, they're seeing the heat, they're seeing the incredible hurricane season we had last year, and they're starting to make much more of a connection in Sacramento and in DC that climate is a big part of that. It's not just happening as natural variability. So that's our legislative report. Stay tuned. We will have more for you in the newsletter monthly and also in some special Baycan emails as to where you can help us push on some of these things. And that's my report, David.
Great, Bruce, thank you. Obviously, readiness, preparedness will soon be linked to availability of funding, we hope, and that's going to be really important. So having our collective acts together and individually at a local level, which many of us, of course, are doing, is going to be the way we can take advantage of this environment changing. Wow, Susan says that AB 15 just passed out of Natural Resource Committee. AB 1500 has real money for regional collaboration. I mean, it's a down payment on collaboration that would take budgets way beyond where they are now, and on projects to an extent as well. So progress there. Any questions on this? We're a little behind time, but I don't want to cut off if there's any questions that have occurred to anyone. I don't see any raised hands.
Does Baycan take positions on these, or is that just ARCA?
You know, we took a position pro 1087. We established legislative principles for regional collaboration legislation that fed into the AB 897 process. We haven't formally done an endorsement on 897. That really should happen most particularly at a local level, and we should be doing more to solicit local endorsements. San Francisco Board of Supervisors passed a resolution last week unanimously endorsing 897. We need more of that we can. But Baycan can do this within the confines of our parent organization, which is LGC, which is a 501c3 organization, which can do some lobbying, but not a lot. So we have to be cautious there, but not necessarily silent.
And David, if I could add that, and that's a good question, what we'll try to do in the next few weeks is really focus in on where your letters or support, either from your agencies or organizations or from possibly Baycan as a whole, where those could really make a difference. So you're not having to wade through all of that.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, let's move to Bay Area Adaptation Resilience News. The first item is to hear an update on BayAdapt from Jessica and or Dana from BCDC. Jessica Fain, Planning Director, BCDC, Dana Breckwald, who is managing BayAdapt day-to-day for BCDC.
It will be me, David.
Dana, hi.
Thanks. So we've been working on developing the joint platform over the past several months, and we've gone through lots of avenues to do this and getting lots of feedback. The first thing is we're working with the subcommittee of our leadership advisory group and working groups to help really refine the joint platform, including David has served on that. So thank you for your time. We've had 10 focus groups over the past couple of months, including a few with frontline communities in East Palo Alto and Vallejo. We had a business focused focus group, an environmental focus group, and a handful of focus groups with local governments, including one that we co-hosted with Baycan. Jessica and I have also in the past couple of months given over 50 presentations to local governments. We've hit almost every county. We've met with JPAs, we've met with agencies, professional organizations, and regional bodies like MTC and BARC and BCDC. This has all resulted in a second draft of the joint platform, which we are just getting around to finalizing about now. So stay tuned. You will all be seeing it sometime in the near future. We've also been continuing to work with our EJ caucus on how we can best structure engagement with frontline communities, not just in the development of the joint platform, but how we move forward in implementation. And then our next steps is we've started having some really meaningful conversations about governance, who's responsible for implementing this, how do we decide, how do we structure it in a way that ensures collaboration without creating a lot of new structures. We will be planning a leadership advisory group meeting late May, early June, knock on wood, we really hope. We'd love to get our leadership group back together again. And then lastly, we are also planning another public forum sometime probably in June-ish, and we'll be continuing to do outreach to talk to people about the new structure of the joint platform. So that is what is going on with us. Jessica, feel free to pop in if I missed anything.
No, that was great, Dana. Just kind of like to respond, I think, to Carl and some of the comments earlier about how do we, youth engagement and education that David was mentioning. You know, the joint platform for BayAdapt is really trying to think very comprehensively about what are the top 15 things that the Bay Area needs to do to adapt to sea level rise. And a whole category of it is around this topic of how do we, about people, and how do we kind of make sure next generation are prepared and ready to tackle this climate problem, and specifically around adaptation and sea level rise. And so there's going to be some recommendations in there. There's been a little bit of work with some various folks from different school districts and county education departments. But I think we're very much at the early stages of that. And so, and quite frankly, BCDC isn't really an education entity. And so if that's an area that folks are really interested in, I would say that's something that we could use a lot of support and help with. And so if that is an issue area that you're passionate about, chat us, me or Dana, and we'd love some extra support in thinking about how we really bolster that area.
Thank you, Jessica and Dana. Those of us who've been following and participating in BayAdapt process know that it's been deep. It's gone on for a while, and I think that's a good thing. It overlaps a lot of the other issues that we talk about in legislation, on equity, and on collaboration, legislation at the state level. That's a good thing. We have a lot going on. It's also an important thing to keep collaborating, coordinating, and ensuring that we're not duplicating, but adding value across all of the functions that are really important. And BayAdapt and AB 897, as it plays out over time, attacks on other climate-related issues at a regional level, since BayAdapt is focused mostly on sea level rise. These will all be continuing challenges that we're all going to be a part of and be aware of. Any questions on BayAdapt from anyone? I'll throw that open briefly. We are behind in time a little bit, but that's all right.
You can also chat us if you want to ask questions, so we can move on the agenda.
All right, then seeing no hands up. This is a moment for Baycan member or partner news. Does anybody want to give an update on something interesting, a brief one, maybe 30 seconds or a minute that people can follow up on if interested? This is an opportunity for that.
This is Tanya from Sonoma County. I can give just a brief update. We recently finished a Urban Land Institute Resilience Advisory Services panel in Sonoma County, and we have posted the presentation of the results or recommendations from the panel on our website, along with a link to more information. And we expect a report to come out from the Urban Land Institute with more detailed recommendations later this summer, and we will also make that available. So, and I'll put a link to our website in the chat.
And remind us what RCPA stands for, please.
Sorry, we are the Regional Climate Protection Authority in Sonoma County.
Yes, of course. Great. Thank you. Any others?
This is
Jack.
State Coastal Conservancy, and I just want to make a pitch that we still have our Prop 68 climate grant round for the Bay Area open. I think it's been open since January, but still open. I'll put the link in the chat.
Thank you, Shalani. Money available, yes. I see Susan's hand and Jack's hand. Susan.
Yeah, just a report from NorCal Resilience Network. We're in month 3 of our Community Resilience Hub leadership training with some of you that are on this call, working with many different government partners and 40 different sites around Northern California to catalyze resilience hubs. So excited about that effort.
Great. Thank you, Susan. Jack.
As with every local government, we are required to update our housing element, and we have new allocations of the amount of housing that we have to locate within the county. In our case, the last round, we had to absorb 120 new units. This round, we're charged with absorbing 3,569 units. This will be a very interesting exercise. We have combined it with the update to our safety element under SB 379, which is essentially an adaptation plan, and we'll also set some constraints to make sure that when we plan that housing, we don't put it in areas that are irretrievably hazardous or will be inundated in the future. So it's going to be an interesting trick.
Thank you for that update. Any others? Seeing no hands.
Hey,
See a
David.
hand, Warner, and then someone else spoke, but Warner, is that Mike?
Yeah, this is just more of a piece of information. I think what Bruce raised is something that people should really be aware of, which is that, you know, we suddenly have Christmas upon us, in which the governor and the legislature are going to have discussions literally in the next 6 weeks on how to allocate $15 to $20 billion in unanticipated tax revenue. So this offers an opportunity really for people to step up and suggest very major allocations for things like have been discussed in the last 30 minutes. You should be aware that track probably on May 14th is when the governor is likely to roll out his what's called the May revise, where he updates his budget, where he'll put his proposals on the table. The legislators will probably counter with some proposal either that day or a few days later. And then between now and middle to late June, there will be negotiations between the governor and the legislature. So just be very aware that there will be probably a once in a decade opportunity that's going to occur in the next 7 weeks, in which the governor and the legislature are going to have dueling proposals on how to spend 15 to 20 billion dollars. And that may even preclude and maybe even endanger a bond measure in 2022 if the governor feels nervous that he may not want in the midst of a recall to be signing on legislation asking for $5 billion more when he just got a windfall of 15 to 20 billion. I'm purely speculating on that, but just to say there's a very critical window of opportunity in the next 6 weeks that you really all should be very intensely focused on tracking.
Thank you for bringing that to us, Warner. That highlights, it takes a lot of work to be aware of this stuff, and Warner is tracking it as closely as anyone. And Bruce, as the manager of our state government engagement program, which technically doesn't launch formally until July 1, but is really underway now, is developing that awareness as well. So everyone has their own, or many have their own government affairs folks, but to the extent that you want information on what's happening, want to get information on what's happening to your government affairs folks or to your program, be in touch with Bruce, and we'll keep that coordinated within Baycan. That's one of our big objectives heading forward, because we know this is stuff that's happening now. Michael.
Hey, David. Yeah, thank you for that. And I was going to repeat what Warner said, but thank you for saying it so clearly, Warner. I'm working with the Local Government Commission on a similar initiative. Warner, I know you're also talking with a few folks over there, and just highlighting this is a historical moment, but also preparing for the infrastructure stimulus to come that likely to come later in the year from the federal government. So following this May revise work, would love to talk with folks about how to engage and support informed discussions with state, federal agencies on that infrastructure stimulus. So maybe that'll be the next meeting. But the other thing I wanted to bring up was wearing my Fairlawn Strategies hat. We're a partner with the California Resilience Partnership, and we had our first advisory board meeting last month. And a new initiative just launched starting in San Diego and LA. The expectation is that we're going to be across the entire state in the next couple of years, supporting all regions, supporting stronger governance, stronger philanthropic public partnerships on project implementation. So if you'd like to talk a little bit more about that, please reach out. I'm happy to set up a call and connect with folks on that project.
Thanks, Michael. Jack has re-raised his hand, and then we're going to go to the next item, and
It's
follow-up can be in the chat. Jack.
A different question for Bruce and Warner. So there's $20 billion at the state level. Does anyone, since we are primarily a local government organization, does anyone know if there will be allocation of any of that money to make cities and counties whole in terms of the money that they've spent battling COVID? Is any of that money going to pass through directly to our local governments?
That's kind of above my pay grade, but I do know that part of what's going on in Sacramento right now is it's equal parts maybe of this budget surplus, because the 1% have been paying a lot of taxes not their fair share maybe, but a lot of taxes, and there's a surplus, but there's also reimbursement going on from the feds to the state to deal with some things that had to get cut during COVID. So that's all I know about that part of it, Jack.
That'd be good to know where we stand in that or where we're going.
I've been asked to provide more documentation than I did before for my disaster service workers service because of a reimbursable program. I think it's federal, but I honestly don't know. Jack, follow up with me and I'll clarify where that's coming from when I look at the email. So in other words, I think there is some kind of reimbursement that's out there if you jump through the right hoops. Okay, so we're going to move to the next item in 5 minutes after a really short bio break. That bio break will end at exactly 10:41 using my phone here. And it's all of your phones at the same time. So please do come back in 5 minutes because we have a dense and really interesting subject coming up on heat, drought, and fire. So see you in 5. Okay, we're going to regather. Jack, you still have your hand up. Just stalling. Okay, so 2021, heat, drought, and fire. Who's not thinking about that? The answer is nobody. So it's a timely topic, and we have a fantastic speaker, which of course is Bruce, but after him comes Daniel Swain, one of the most prominent climate scientists in the state right now. We used to have him up here in NorCal, but he's down in SoCal now, but that's all right. He'll be joining us in a moment. But Bruce is going to get us started with an overview of what we're looking at for 2021.
Great, thanks, David, and welcome everyone. Heat, drought, and fire, 2021 and beyond, obviously. Here are the two questions that we're going to ask you in breakouts in a few minutes. And again, put in a plug for writing a couple of sentences about your answers in the chat box as we go through this item. We're going to ask in the breakouts what actions you are planning, your organization is planning for the 2021 heat, drought, and fire season, which has already started, as you know. And if you're not doing something or not planning something, what would you like your organization to be doing? So we want to get a little inspiration going here as well. 3 parts to this segment of our meeting. I'm going to do a quick intro about heat, drought, and fire. Then we're going to send you to breakouts where you're going to talk about these questions. What are you doing? And then we'll come back and we're going to have Daniel Swain from UCLA, really one of the rising stars in the climate world, who's going to talk in more depth about what's the latest research show us. What are the ties between heat, drought, and fire, and where are we headed beyond 2021? So 3 parts, and I will start. First segment is going to be on heat. And we'll go just like, let's see, I'm just going to click here. Start my timer so I get us back on time. This is the very familiar graph that we've had for years, showing over maybe 140 years, industrial revolution kicking in, and both greenhouse gas emissions and temperature going up. Temperature up now about a little over a degree C, which is almost 2 degrees Fahrenheit over the last 140 years. But the really important thing with heat and temperature are these 4 charts coming here. Some places are going to be quite a bit hotter than others. And we've seen over the last couple of decades, the hottest places and the biggest warming has been in the Arctic. But look at 2020, the darker the red color, the more increase over the normal temperature, and you really saw it a lot in Siberia, some in Europe. So different places are going to heat at different times and rates. Second is the rate of change for temperature is the fastest it's been in 1,000 years. That's a problem for adaptation. We are, as humans and as plants and as animals and all, easier to adapt if the temperature change goes more slowly. It's not. It's going at the fastest rate in the last 1,000 years. That's a problem for us. Nights are warming. This is happening globally and here in California. Nights are warming more than days so far. And you see the 2 charts here for Phoenix. Yes, they've had a number of days increase of temperatures over 110, but they've had many more warmer nights in Phoenix. And again, this is happening everywhere. This is difficult for health because for human health, we need to cool off at night. And this is a big problem that the nights are even warmer and going up faster. It's also a problem some for agriculture and particularly fruit and nut trees. Finally, extremes matter. You know, we talk about a degree or a degree and a half, and those are averages across land and ocean. Land temperatures the extremes are what matter. And you can see an extreme heat wave in 2019 here in India and Pakistan, where you were starting to get urban temperatures up to the 50 degrees C mark, which is about 122 degrees Fahrenheit. So we're starting to see in these extremes in different places around the world, we're getting close to unlivable urban areas, and it's going to happen here as well. This is going on in California. Those were all global. It's going on in California. You can see of the different regions in our state on this map, and we are the F region right here, that nighttime temperatures are going up, average temperatures and daytime temperatures. It doesn't matter which region you're in across the state. Even cooler areas like San Francisco are setting records. This is a cool thing where if you go back to like the decade I was born in, we used to have in the old world about an equal number for a decade of record highs and record lows. But you can see how that's changed over the last 60 or 70 years. We have many more now record highs than we ever have record lows. And that's a trend, again, that's going on here in California and elsewhere. And finally, this gets to us last summer and fall. Okay. We had 3 record months in California, August, September, and October. Could you mute your phone?
That's just a fuse. But
somebody is not on mute. Can you mute yourself, please? Thank you. August, September, and October 2020 shattered California temperature records. So when we get to your breakouts in a few minutes, here are some things that we want you to be thinking about. What about outdoor workers? What about homes without air conditioning? How about seniors who are living alone and maybe have no one to check in on them to see how they're doing in a heat wave? How about people, as Ami said, that have no transportation to get to a cooling center? And think about in your breakouts and what you're thinking about doing in your organization this summer. Think about neighborhoods that have fewer trees and more impervious surfaces. We have great research here in the Bay Area on low-income neighborhoods having fewer trees and having more hard surfaces. It increases the heat effects in the urban heat island. Think about our agricultural lands and what this heat is doing and is going to do. And think about parks and open space, which are so valuable to us. Drought is the second thing that we're talking about here today. And this was a picture from 1976 when we actually had to put a pipe on the Richmond-San Rafael Bridge to take water from the East Bay to Marin, which was suffering the most because they're dependent completely on local water in that big drought in the 70s. Here's a quick map that you can find yourself on of the different major water agencies. We have quite a few in the region. And on the right-hand side, you get an overall sense of where our water comes from. So this one, local surface and groundwater, about a third of our water in the Bay Area is from surface local supplies, but 2/3 is from the Sierras, either through the state and the Central Valley water projects or through the pipes, the Tuolumne pipe that San Francisco has and the McCullum pipe that the East Bay Mud has. So about 2/3 the Sierra and about a third local. If you look at this cool one, and we won't spend a lot of time on it, you take the sources, purple is local, and you can see Solano has local, Sonoma and Marin have only local, and the other places that come from the Sierra here in varying amounts bring that water to our different districts. It's an interesting system. There aren't a lot of interties between the systems. So while our folks have different sources of water, some will run, some will run drier this year quicker than others. Okay, so we can look at this another time. All these things are going to be available after the meeting. So again, looking at what's going on with drought, no 100-year trend in total precipitation. And Daniel Swain will talk more about this and some other science issues in a minute. While we have a 100-year trend in temperature, it is up. the total precip is not up. It's got no real variance here for 100 years. Is up though is the variability. We're getting more dry years, and we're getting more wet years. And again, Daniel will talk about how this is causing problems for our water systems. Droughts are really happening a lot because of these atmospheric river events, either having them or not. If you look at this black line here is total precipitation over a series of days. And you can see how that is going up and down along with the red line, which is these extreme event years. The green line is more kind of normal rainfall that we have. It doesn't vary too much, but the atmospheric rivers are varying from year to year. Whether we have them or not has a lot to do with whether we're in a drought or whether we're in somewhat of a surplus. There's something, and Daniel will talk about this one, the PDSI really looks at drought here, not just precipitation, it looks at temperature, air temperature, which dries things out more evaporation, all the vegetation gets drier, so you get into soil moisture and vegetation moisture. The PDSI, as we call it, is the key thing to look at, because it's not just the amount of rain, it's the heat that's driving droughts in California. And finally, on this one, Bay Area's got this interesting thing, and the North Coast does as well, of fog, which is such an important thing for our climate and such an important thing for vegetation drying out or not. And there's some conflicting studies right now. It's being looked at a lot because it looks like fog is on the decline in the Bay Area and in Northern California over the last few decades. The jury's still out on this one, but this will have a big deal to do with when we have these low precipitation years, do we also lose fog, which is going to make a big difference for parks, open space, agriculture, and all. So again, when you get in your breakouts, which we'll do in just a couple of minutes, think about some of the communities that are going to be most affected by drought. Central Valley rural communities, some of them running out of water. Marin and Sonoma, which are dependent, we said 100% on local water source, on rainfall, on precipitation. Think about the Sierra users who are, many of the rest of us are drawing on the snowpack, which is down again this year. Think about the high fire areas. Think about parks and open space and ag and working lands. These are just some of the things to think about when you're talking in your breakouts about how your organization is planning or going to. So last one, and I'll wrap up. Fire. We all know about fire. We all know about smoke. It's becoming, the last three out of the last 4 years. In 2017, we set records here and in Southern California for these very large fires and got everyone's attention. In 2018, we broke those records. We broke them for damage. We broke them, unfortunately, for deaths. We broke them for size of the fires, the Carr Fire, the Mendocino Complex, the camp. In 2020, we broke the records again. I won't go through this whole chart. Again, these things will all be available to you. You can use them in your own slideshows and talks. But 2020, here. This is the top set of 15 fires for the state for the last 70 years, 80 years. And 2020, jumped into the top 15 with 5 great big fires. So we are seeing records in California, and it's not just numbers. It's not just headlines, it's people. It's people, it's infrastructure, it's houses, it's people. And we are already, and you get it from smoke as well as from the actual fire areas. The thing goes further than just the immediate areas that have fires. Here's an agricultural worker in the Central Valley having to work outside in the tremendous smoke events that we've had. The PES events that PG&E is proactively turning off power, and the effect on many individuals of that program. So it's not just fire in the fire areas, and you happen to live here in a big city, it's the smoke events and the PSPS that go with it. Fire behavior is changing. I was on a panel last year in Santa Barbara, and these two guys in the middle, 30-year veterans of fighting big major wildfires in Southern California said, folks, these fires are nothing like the fires we used to have when we started our careers. Fire behavior is changing, more intense fires. And finally, these wildfires are bad for health, they're bad for infrastructure, they're bad for a whole set of things, but they're also big greenhouse gas emitters. If you look down here, here's the amount of CO2 emitted in California in a week by all of the cars and trucks on the road pre-pandemic. But look at how fires dwarf that in some of the GHGs that are produced from these great big wildfires that we're having. It's become a real problem for our carbon goals and our climate goals that we're having these big fires. So here's the things to think about again for your breakouts now. What about people that live right in high fire areas? What about fire workers who are having to come in both during a fire and post-fire cleanup? What does that mean for their health? What about all of us that are hit by these smoke events and what it means to certain people with asthma and other pre-existing conditions? What does it mean to outdoor workers to have big smoke events, or the PSPS? What does it mean to have your power turned off if your health is dependent upon powered wheelchairs and breathing apparatus and other types of things? And what about, as Ami was talking about, what about all of the residents with fewer resources to deal with these things? So those are some of the things we want you to be thinking about during your breakout. So we're going to send you off in a minute. Random breakouts, 15 minutes, not 20. We're going to try and catch ourselves up here. Again, what actions are you planning, your organization planning? Throw something out on the table. Or if you're not planning something, what is it that you'd like your organization to do? Share it with the group, 15 minutes, we'll give you a warning. And when you come back, put it in the chat box when you come back so we can save that whole chat box. So this is a sharing time in the breakouts for what your organization is doing or would like to do. I will stop there and we will click on breakout rooms. We're all ready. 15 minutes. I'll give you a warning as we go. Light facilitation. Someone can be the facilitator to make sure everybody has a chance to talk here. Have fun, and we'll see you in 15 minutes.
Hello, are you there?
Yes.
Who else is there?
Hold on, Carl. I'm trying to assign people. I'll get back to you in just a second.
Okay. Bruce, how's your schedule these days?
Hold on. I can't do two. I'm too old to do two things at once, Carl.
Oh, you must be pretty old.
I am older every day. Hold on. I'm just getting some of the people that are not in a meeting to get them into something here so they can all be there. Assign 10. Daniel, I'm not going to assign you. You're going to be here. Carl, do you want to be assigned to a room?
Yeah, I think trying to keep people together.
Yeah, I was going to put you with Ryan. Is it Ryan? No, it's Matt. It's Matt. I'm going to put you in room 8 with Matt, okay? Right now. Okay. Hello, Daniel.
Hi.
Okay, I think we can breathe for a minute. We're a little bit behind, but not too much. Woo. Yeah.
Do you think will I still be done by around I guess it would be noon West Coast time?
Absolutely. Before.
Sounds good.
Let's see. I give them 15 minutes and let me just mark the time here. So they're going to quit at 11:13. Yeah, so we're about 13 minutes behind, so we'll have a little less time for Q&A with you. Yeah, I think we're okay. I'm just going to take a breath now. Let me look at the let me come back in just a minute. I just have to look at the rooms and make sure they're pretty evenly distributed. Yep, they are.
That's good.
Yeah, we have another item after you, so you and I need to finish our item really at 11:45. Okay.
Okay.
So if we bring them back at 11:13 and you do 20 minutes, that's 11:33. So we'll have 10 or 12 minutes for Q&A. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, I will may cut a couple slides then real quick. Let's see.
Yeah, we got behind right at the beginning today, and we've been running to catch up ever since. You know how that goes.
Yeah, yeah.
So you're in where are you in the mountain zone?
Boulder, Colorado.
Okay, beautiful. Oh, because you're an NCAR, of course. Yeah.
Right.
And so how does that work? You're at UCLA and NCAR?
Yeah. Yeah, the IRS only knows that I'm employed by UCLA actually. So officially that's my role as a scientist at UCLA, but it's really a triple appointment, UCLA, NCAR, and the Nature Conservancy.
Right.
But the anchor institution is actually UCLA, despite the fact my physical office is at NCAR. So it's a pretty unusual arrangement.
Yeah, interesting. I've been to NCAR. My brother lives in Boulder, so I went over when Susie Mosier was working there in the very old days, and saw it up there on the up on the hill, up on the mesa, I guess is what it is.
Oh yeah, the Mesa Lab is a gorgeous building. Mine, well, whenever I get back to my office after 14 or 15 months out of it, it's down in an office park in the plains, but it's a pretty, Boulder, as you know, is a town with a lot of scientists, specifically atmospheric scientists in a lot of cases. So it's an interesting place to be for sure.
And how did Berkeley let you get out of the Bay Area?
I don't know. There haven't been very many institutions that are willing to support a high level of public communication. That has been essentially a no-go for almost all the institutions that are out there. So it's the main reason I'm not in the tenure track role as well. Is because that's you just don't have the bandwidth. You just physically can't be that flexible about these kinds of things. So
we need. I mean, I'm working on negative emissions and carbon removal some now at Berkeley with people, and a couple of the best people are not on tenure track. They're doing the work. They're out in the big world. They're talking about all of this, and so it's here. Let me assign somebody here.
Hi, Bruce.
Yeah, hi. Uh-oh. I just assigned somebody who wanted to come back, maybe. Well, we're glad you're with us. We had a presentation earlier from Ami Raval from APEN, all on resilience and resilience hubs, and big focus on vulnerable communities and low-income communities, and she touched on the heat and the drought and the fires and the smoke here, and the impact on folks that are already suffering from a variety of things in more vulnerable communities.
yeah, there's a lot of compounding effects at this point, and those are only going to accelerate.
Yep. I think for you to touch on that will be good. I showed him in my quick little run through just some of the basic science things that are happening, but for you to pull them together as they are would, like your slides do, I think will be really helpful.
Yeah, and I'll try and end as early as I can, so there's enough time to actually have some discussion, since I think that might really come out then, especially.
So I'm going to bring them back at 11:13, and let's get your, let's see, let me stop sharing and you can start sharing and put your, we don't lose time there.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, got 7 minutes. And I've asked them to put a couple sentences about things in the chat box about things they're doing. So we're going to collect them in that way too. And questions. I'll be monitoring while you're talking. I'll monitor the chat box and see if we've got questions there for you.
Sounds good.
Okay. But you can take a full 20 minutes. We'll start at 11:13 and you can go to 11:33 there. And then we'll have 10 or 12 minutes for Q&A.
It's good to me.
Yeah, got to give them the 5-minute warning here in a second. I always laugh at Boulder's weather. You know, you guys go up and down like you know, that away from the ocean, you know.
Oh yeah.
You were 40 something, 42 the other day and then 62, you know.
Oh, we get a lot wider swings than that. I mean, we've been, it's almost always, 70 degrees the day before we get a big snowstorm here, even in the middle of winter. It's just, it's always kind of fun. We're currently having a thunderstorm, so it's, all that mid-continent variability.
Yeah. You know, the Bay Area, we complain when it's, out of a 10-degree range that we think is normal,
Well, a lot of things are relative, but that's the problem is that it is, it is a matter of what is normal for a particular place. So.
Do you want me to give you a 5-minute warning when we get to the 5 minutes to go mark?
Sure. Yeah, since it's designed to be a slightly longer talk, so that probably is a good idea.
Yeah, okay. The item after you is going, after we do Q&A, is we're starting some work here on creating, or at least designing, a Bay Area Climate Science Center or program. that would eventually involve Berkeley and Stanford and others, all focused on the Bay Area. We've been waiting for about 10 years for it, so we're going to take the bull by the horns and start working on it, on what it ought to look like and who could run it and what kind of funding we're going to need. And
Yeah, that sounds, I'm glad to hear that that's going to happen. I mean, that remains the big hurdle in a lot of cases is the funding. Unfortunately, it's
absolutely
a lot of these projects.
Yeah, we need funding. We've been, had our folks tell us every day of the year, they need help interpreting and understanding science. It's not just new science. So it's got to be some new things, but it's got to be some assistance. They want to call you and talk to you about something, not just go to a conference and hear about it.
I mean, that's what I do a lot of, and that's what I constantly, aside from the current support that I have, which is ever tenuous. I mean, there's just not, funding bodies don't want to support it. Private entities don't think it's dramatic enough. So there's really sort of a gap where nobody's willing to fundamentally offer their support financially, or even just in terms of, institutional support as well.
Yeah. Nope, we've run into that. And so that's going to be a big hurdle. But we think if we'll, instead of waiting for somebody else, we'll design something we think that will work here, and then we'll go fundraising for it. We'll see.
Yeah, that's probably the way to do it. For better or for worse, I think you probably have to come up with something specific and then ask people to contribute to that specific model.
Yeah. Yeah, and maybe we have to do some proving of how valuable it's going to be. So, okay, we're almost back. Looks like more. Welcome back, folks. Hope that was helpful. Please, again, if you didn't already, type a sentence or two with your name and organization in the chat box about something you're planning to do this summer or spring or fall, or something you'd like to be doing. Put them in the chat box. Make sure your name and organization is there so that I can contact you later when we need a little more info. So great. So to wrap up this segment, we have one of the rising stars of climate work in California and the region and the nation. Daniel Swain used to be at Stanford, but now is at UCLA at NCAR in Boulder and with the Nature Conservancy. And Daniel's got a much longer talk that he's going to condense down to 20 minutes here and really get us a good, better understanding of the science of where we are and where we're going. So Daniel, if you can share your screen big, that'll be just perfect. The floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Bruce. Hopefully it is big on everyone's screen right now.
We're looking good.
All right, sounds good. Well, since I have a relatively short amount of time, I'm just going to jump right into it and start just with just a reminder that I think at this point is probably abundantly obvious to everybody in this meeting that California is already a different place than it used to be, climatically speaking, and it's a much warmer state. The warming is no longer subtle. 20, 30 years ago, it was detectable, but maybe not noticeable. I don't think that's true anymore. It is genuinely noticeable, I think, from a lot of practical perspectives. And as a result, in addition to the warming temperatures, mountain snowpack is now decreasing noticeably. Again, that was something that the last time a lot of these assessments were done 15 years ago with a little bit equivocal, but mostly prediction for the future. That future has now arrived, and we're now seeing that in the real world, along with snow lines decreasing. And also a large increase in wildfire size and severity being the more important part of that equation, I believe, from a practical perspective and from an ecological perspective. And while climate change is not the only reason why that's happening, it is a big part of the story. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that towards the end of the talk. But I really just want to jump into what I think the main point is, which is that California's precipitation is not necessarily changing in the way that I think a lot of people assume that it is, which is to say there has not been a large decrease or an increase in the overall amount of precipitation occurring in California. There have been some small regional changes, but it's not really clear that those are related to climate change, and the magnitude of those changes has been small. So you might ask, well, then how the heck have we had so many extreme drought years and even a couple of big rain and flood years interspersed with these, if that's the case? And the answer is that, consistent with climate model predictions, what I believe we're starting to see is an increase in what we've called precipitation whiplash. So this increase in both wet and dry extremes that in the long run mathematically average out to about zero change. But of course, in any given year or any given moment, practically speaking, definitely don't average out to the same conditions that we had historically. And so this is consistent, again, what we're seeing recently, where we've seen a lot of extremely dry years, but also some conspicuously wet ones. If you recall, 2016, 2017 was the singularly wettest winter on record in parts of Northern California, despite the fact that we've now had multiple years in the same decade that have experienced the driest years on record in the same places. So we are seeing more of both. It's just been that the drought has been a little bit more conspicuous, top of mind recently, and in this present moment as well. And beyond the sort of that whiplash from year to year that's increasing, and even from day to day within the wet season, we also have another aspect of the shifting seasonality precipitation that I think is increasing what I guess we could call the seasonal whiplash, which is already pretty high historically in California. We have wet winters and bone dry summers to a greater extent than most places in North America. That's already a pretty stark seasonal contrast, but we'd normally get some form of transition in the shoulder seasons in spring and autumn. And what we're starting to realize is that those transition seasons are becoming ever narrower and are producing less water. Essentially, the most conspicuous trend so far has been drying autumn. Spring has not exhibited a long-term trend yet in terms of decreasing precipitation, although obviously this year is shaping up to be an extremely dry spring. But what climate models suggest about the future is that both of the shoulder seasons, autumn and spring, will become drier, the later onset to the rainy season and an earlier curtailment of the wet season. But interestingly, not during winter. So this notion that we may see less precipitation when we already saw sort of marginal precipitation in the shoulder seasons, but potentially the same amount or even more precipitation in the months that were already really wet, the core winter season months from December through March. And so what that means, well, I think we're already starting to see what it means in the real world, that further narrowing of the rainy season has pretty big implications for wildfire risk, especially on the back end, so in the autumn, more so than the spring. It has big implications for snowpack, which we're observing right now outside the window, and ecosystem stresses and agriculture, because it extends both the natural and the agricultural growing seasons and the irrigation season. Not only are you bringing less water for more of the year, but you're also increasing the demand for water at the same time, but there's less to go around. But speaking of drought, though, in a broader sense, I think it's really important to realize that, and I've gotten this comment actually so many times in the past 24 hours, it's kind of boggled my mind. Because California's mean precipitation hasn't decreased, then there therefore cannot have been an increase in drought, right? That's the argument that I keep hearing over and over again. Of course, that's not true for a variety of reasons. And the main number one reason it's not true is that precipitation only metrics of drought, essentially just measuring the rainfall or the snowfall deficit, is becoming increasingly misleading as the climate warms, because as we see warmer and warmer temperatures, droughts are increasingly driven by the increased evaporation and transpiration that occurs as a direct result of those warming temperatures. So while precipitation deficits are obviously still important and often can initiate the drought, how bad the drought becomes and how long it lasts actually increasingly has to do with how warm the temperatures are. And so because of this, the net effect is that the same amount of rain and snow just doesn't go as far as it used to. And I'm not talking about an urban water use efficiency perspective. I'm just talking about a geophysical water balance perspective, where the same amount of water falls from the sky and a much greater fraction of it immediately re-enters the atmosphere than it used to because it's warmer. And we can see this just by looking at the left. Obviously, as I mentioned, no real trend in mean precipitation but a very strong and sustained trend in warming temperatures, and also an increasingly obvious trend in the overall metrics of aridity, of drought. And so it's pretty clear that temperature is primarily driving this. It's also true that these other changes in precipitation that are not related to the mean that I just mentioned are also important. The shifting seasonality matters. If you have longer dry seasons, that's another. Even if you sort of make up for it in the winter months, you're not really making up for it from a water balance perspective. If the precipitation is falling in shorter, sharper bursts, as we expect to occur, and as I think is already starting to occur, then you also expect increased runoff in the moment, but less moisture soaking into the soil column, recharging aquifers, less available during the dry season. So all of these things contribute to increasing drought frequency and severity, despite the fact that mean precipitation hasn't changed much and actually isn't expected necessarily to change very much in the future. So all of this leads to a bit of a paradox, which is that California really faces a simultaneous increase in both water scarcity, but also overabundance. So the flood risk is also looming large as well. And this is because, again, as I mentioned, less autumn and spring precipitation, but potentially a little more winter precipitation and certainly stronger individual winter storms. So more precipitation, but on fewer days in winter with more intense, but again, fewer storms during the rainy season. So couple that with a dramatic decline in snowpack with each additional degree of warming and more evaporation, and you put that all together, and really what you bring about is an increased risk of both drought and flood. And so on the flood side, because I think it's gotten a little undersold, not quite enough attention that it deserves in recent years, we've really started looking at this more closely. And the river sediment records suggest that enormous floods on the order of what happened during the Great Flood of 1862 in California occur something like every 200 years, maybe every 100 years, but it's something that we haven't had since all of our major infrastructure was developed and all of our water management policies were developed in the 20th century, certainly. The last time this happened was 1862. And it's obvious that a modern day repeat would be completely disastrous for California. Large swaths of the Central Valley were turned into an inland sea when this happened in 1862. Most of Los Angeles County and Orange County were underwater at one point, where tens of millions of people currently live. Despite the modern flood infrastructure we have in place today that wasn't there in 1862, it's not clear that the outcome would be greatly different for an event of this truly extreme magnitude. And what we found in climate model simulations is that there's something like a 50-50 chance that this happens in the next 40 years. So we're not going out to 2100 a year. We're talking about something that's slightly longer than the average home loan on the timescale of an individual mortgage. There's about a 1 in 2 chance that this will happen. And as you go farther out into the century, that risk rises further. So clearly the odds are going up, even in this era that we're really laser focused on water scarcity and drought and wildfire for understandable reasons. But I think at our peril, we ignore the other side of the hydrologic coin. And the main reason why this risk is increasing, I think, is probably pretty intuitive. We looked into this and looked at what the most intense storms of the future look like compared to the most intense storms of sort of our present era and the past era. And the main thing that changes is the intensity of atmospheric rivers increases, mainly because there's just so much more potential water vapor in the atmosphere as the temperature warms. You may have heard that the amount of water vapor in the atmosphere can increase at a rate of 7% per degree centigrade. So that's an exponential increase in water vapor for a linear increase in temperature. And that pretty much explains this effect. With a few degrees of warming, you've dramatically increased the upper end potential of precipitation. You haven't necessarily increased the overall amount of precipitation by that amount because you still need the storm to arrive at your doorstep to deliver the water. But really what we're saying is that when the storms arrive, they have much greater potential to drop a lot of water very quickly and produce historically unprecedented precipitation and therefore flood events. And so we actually looked specifically at some of the flood risk in urban parts of California, what kinds of areas get inundated in the future relative to the 20th century. And the 100-year floodplains look really different as a result of this. They are greatly expanded, and in a lot of cases, they expand outside of major flood protection zones. So, climate change is actually quite likely to increase flood risk in almost all of California's flood vulnerable regions, which is a lot more regions than I think many people realize, because floods here are somewhat infrequent. We don't have to deal with them as much as we have to deal with wildfires, for example. And some really serious flooding is certainly possible if we see a repeat of something like 1862. And so I think that raises real questions about what our flood protection infrastructure will, how it will fare in a megastorm. Not just the main stem rivers, but also urban tributaries. Places in Los Angeles County and in the urban areas ringing the San Francisco Bay are actually quite vulnerable to urban flooding and these sorts of extreme atmospheric river storms that bring storm surge and strong winds along with them. And of course, sea level will be higher, with each passing decade as well. So all of these are potentially compounding risks that are quite different from the ones I think that most people are used to thinking about in a warming world where we're seeing a lot of drought and dryness and fire in California. And then you get to the real big questions, the real thorny ones about what happens to the major infrastructure, the life protection levees in the Central Valley and California's major dams. And the Army Corps of Engineers has, in the last couple of years, made some pretty alarming statements, I think, frankly, about the state, the potential structural issues at some of the major dams, especially in Southern California, that are immediately above large population centers and are supposedly at potential risk of structural failure given a large enough storm event. Now, their estimate of what a large enough storm event is something they call maybe the 500 to the 800-year flood, but almost all the evidence suggests that they're not really talking about an event that happens once a millennium. They're actually just talking about something like 1862, which, as I'll remind everybody, we find that there's about a 50-50 chance that it happens in the next 40 years. So there is some real risk out there that I think is being underestimated. And then I will sort of finish up with a discussion of wildfires, because I think it's top of mind, and unfortunately, I think it's the most immediate issue if we're talking about this year. Just a brief reminder that, it may be obvious that wildfires are primarily fueled by vegetation of different kinds, but I think it's important to emphasize that no two wildfires are the same. And in California, you have wildfires that are true forest fires, in some cases, if they're burning in the Sierra Nevada and the coniferous forests or in the Coast Ranges in the redwoods or something. But you can also have, in Southern California, fires that behave very differently in different ecosystems. Fires in the brush and the chaparral behave quite differently and have different frequency and hazards associated with them than do the timber fires. And in the Central Valley, you can even have grass fires still. So these are all different kinds of fires that have different character. And on a fundamental level, wildfire is a natural process. It's not a disaster unless it actually causes harm. And intrinsically, fires are actually quite a natural part of the landscape and provide a lot of ecosystem benefits when they occur at a frequency and intensity to which ecosystems are actually adapted to. And so susceptibility to fire is a function of both, background climate and local vegetation conditions. And both of those things can change over time. It's not just that climate and weather evolve, but also the vegetation that's in a particular location can change over time. And we're starting to see that in a warming world in the American West, where forests in some cases are transitioning to non-forest ecosystems. And deserts are increasingly becoming populated with invasive grasses that allow fires to occur in places where historically the vegetation was just too sparse. And on another level, not all fires are created equal because the intensity can vary a lot. You can get very high intensity fires and very low intensity fires. You can get fires that burn very large areas almost uninterruptedly, or fires that have a very mosaic burn pattern where you have essentially a checkerboard of burned, unburned, high intensity, and low intensity. And so whether or not a fire is harmful or beneficial is largely dependent on the context, how intense it was, how large it was, and where it's occurring. And from a human impacts perspective, whether or not it's occurring in a place where people live, and whether it's generating large amounts of smoke that is traveling to places where lots of people live. So I think a lot of us can agree that there is a problem. We've got a problem in California with respect to wildfire. But what's really driving that problem, and what's the essence of it? There's a few key pillars. And I think the first of which I think we talk about a lot in urban settings, which is this expansion of populated areas into high-risk zones. And this is a real issue. It has happened to an increasing extent in recent decades, where there's just more people and more stuff in harm's way. So had there been absolutely no change in fire activity or behavior, you would expect there to be some increase in the number of property losses and lives lost simply on account of the fact that we're putting more of those things in places that burn on a regular basis. But obviously that's only relevant in and near urban areas. The second pillar is this legacy of 20th century total forest fire suppression, this idea that we put out every fire, we extinguish them as fast as possible. We removed all of the natural lower intensity fires from the landscape, which has resulted in a large accumulation of unnaturally dense vegetation in a lot of the forested areas. But of course, that's mostly relevant in forests, and a lot of the fires that occur in California aren't really true forest fires. So that is of limited relevance in some places as well. But the overarching theme I just want to emphasize, because partly because I'm a climate scientist, but partly because it is pervasive across the landscape, is climate change. It's getting warmer across ecosystems. It's getting warmer both in urban areas and non-urban areas. And so this is sort of a unifying element that is amplifying both of the first two pillars where they occur, but is relevant across a much broader region. And so ends up being, in aggregate, I think, a really important factor in thinking about the big picture. So what's the role of warming? I'll go quickly through these, but it's actually pretty intuitive. As temperatures rise, the gap between how much water could be in the atmosphere and how much is actually in the atmosphere is increasing. It's known as this widening vapor pressure deficit. So what that really means is there's increasing atmospheric demand for water. The atmosphere increasingly has a propensity to act like a giant sponge and suck water out of plants, out of the soil. And that leads to soil water depletion and vegetation becoming drier than it would have been historically, which makes the vegetation more flammable, leads to more intense burning fires and more extremely behaving fires. So the hotter they burn, the more likely it is that fires generate their own weather. We've seen fires recently that have essentially generated lightning and tornadoes and their own weather systems to an extent that we hadn't seen in California in really in recorded history. And there's evidence at this point that 50% or more of the observed increase in wildfire acres burned, especially in forest areas, is directly attributable to this warming effect. And this was true when that paper was published about 5 or 6 years ago. We've had more warming since then and more evidence. I suspect the number is probably even larger today. And so in California specifically, and I'll be closing just in a minute or two here, but climate change has already doubled, essentially, the occurrence of extreme fire weather conditions that lead to these extreme burning conditions in autumn over the past few decades. That was actually a surprisingly large increase to those of us who are looking at this. And it's important because climate is mainly changing the severity, the character of fires, rather than the number of fires. We're not seeing more fires in California or throughout the West, but we are seeing more severe and destructive fires. And that's, I think, gets at what the essence of what the problem is. And we're also seeing in California, and we can talk about this in the discussion afterward a bit if anyone's interested, seasonality is really important. So it's not just that it's getting warmer, it's not just that we're seeing drier vegetation, but we're also seeing a shift. That lengthening of the rainy season I mentioned is especially important in autumn, because that's when the long dry summer has maximally dried out all of our vegetation. It's at peak dryness. It's when our offshore winds occur, which is, I think as most people are familiar, that's what drives a lot of our most severe fires. If we extend the dry season by a month in autumn, we not only add a month to fire season, we add a month to the peak of fire season and the overlap with offshore wind season. And so just to emphasize that catastrophic fire in the wild and urban interface is an accelerating crisis, but it's not an inevitable one because the fires themselves are not what are inherently bad. It's the intersection with populated areas that is the problem. And so there are ways to decouple fire from catastrophe. And so, in doing that, the physical reality tells us one thing, that there's going to be an increase in precipitation intensity, but also in aridity, a dramatic loss of snowpack, and more intense fire seasons. But we may be able to mitigate flood and drought risk simultaneously, fight bad fire with good fire, and offer some environmental co-benefits along the way. But one thing that's become really clear is that historical paradigms and management practices from the 21st century or from the 20th century aren't going to work in the 21st century. So I'll just leave these closing thoughts up on the screen since I'd rather give some time for discussion and Q&A now. So, and I'll leave this up as well in case you want to reach out.
Great, thank you very much, Daniel. First question from the chat. Because we're seeing less Sierra snowmelt maybe available for our water systems here, should we be relying more on local and building up local water storage here, say in the Bay Area?
Yeah, I think as a backup, that's a good idea. But I think but we're also seeing the limitations of that right now in places like Marin and Sonoma counties and other districts that don't have these interties that are dependent exclusively on local water. When you do have a severe drought or an infrastructure disruption, I mean, imagine there was just a single pipeline problem somewhere in the mix, or from an earthquake or just from bad luck, from whatever. It makes you kind of vulnerable. And so as long as it's not the only option, and I think, right now, you showed in your slides in the 70s drought that Marin County put that pipeline in the upper deck of the Richmond Centerville Bridge. I heard this week that the Marin Municipal Water is actually putting in plans to do it again this year. We didn't do that during the last drought, so they're really concerned about what may unfold over the next 12 months. So it's, local water is definitely good, a good sort of additional supply that can also be a liability if it's your only supply.
Great. Next question from the chat. We have someone from Marin to ask a question in a minute there. That's right in the bike lane is where that pipe was. There's a new bike lane on the bridge. What's the impact of tree loss? We've lost millions of trees. Is that affecting drought? Is there a circular kind of effect here?
Yeah, it's a good question. We have lost a lot of trees, and unfortunately, I think this year we're probably going to lose a lot more. I'm already hearing some really early stories about mortality and in new places. A lot of the trees we lost during the last big drought were western slope of the Sierra Nevada. I'm hearing about losses right now in the coast ranges and even in sort of the urban forests of the East Bay. That did not happen very much in the last drought, so that's a little bit alarming. There are some places in the world where the moisture recycling from the forest is extremely important for precipitation. California is not one of them, partly because of our proximity to the ocean and the fact we don't really get summer rain. We don't get like summer thunderstorms. Those are the kinds of systems that are usually most intimately tied to this forest moisture recycling. But there probably is some effect because, the Sierra Nevada does get some amount of summer precipitation. It's not a lot, but it's not zero, and it probably does affect summer rainfall across the interior to some extent in a negative way.
Great. Next question is from Jack Liebster in Marin.
Yeah, not to be too parochial, but have you done any calculations about the broader extent of a flooded area when you have the combined runoff from the watershed hitting the higher sea levels? To my knowledge, I haven't been able to find anything that really puts those things together in a dynamic fashion. Have you seen anything like that?
Yeah, I agree. I think that's actually a pretty conspicuous gap. And it's actually something we're hoping to address. So I didn't mention this in the talk. It was actually on the slides that I cut, but we're currently, if any of you have heard of the arc storm scenario from about a decade ago, it was put together by the USGS in the state of California. We're redoing that now. We're doing Arc Storm 2.0 for California. And we actually just got yesterday a chunk of funding from DWR, and we're pending pending grants elsewhere. So this is a pretty big multi-institutional collaboration. A bunch of the UC systems, the Desert Research Institute, USGS. It's the same folks. I don't know if anyone knows Dale Cox, but he's working closely with us. It's the same folks who do like the shakeout, the big earthquake disaster scenarios. We're trying to do that for a mega flood scenario that incorporates climate change and much more nuanced modeling. So I'm hopeful that we're going to be able to get sea level rise baked into that, which would sort of directly address that, because we're looking at extreme storm scenarios in the future. So stay tuned.
Great, thanks. Next is David Bihar from SFPUC.
I wanted to just expand on Susan's question about storage, Daniel. You just mentioned DWR. I don't know if this is outside your bailiwick, but in the old days, we used to worry a lot about low flow stream flows in drought. And a solution to that was to capture high flows in wet seasons in storage wherever it's located. Dams and big reservoirs, local storage, conjunctive use basins in the ground. Is there any conversation at a policy level suggesting that under climate change, this increased variability maybe should drive some infrastructure investments, not because supply is the only place where we can address the imbalance between supply and demand that we have in droughts, but because it is one place? Is that coming up in conversations that you're hearing that might engage the environmental community as well as the water management community and maybe find some solutions?
Yes, it's a good question. And yes, it is in a big way. I think it was hurt by the focus on mean precipitation trends for many years, where there was this notion that, oh, well, the mean precipitation in California probably won't change a lot, so we don't have to worry about it. Whereas, of course, that's actually a very different picture than if you see that the mean isn't changing, not because the precipitation isn't changing, but because you actually get more very wet and more very dry events. It's actually quite a different management picture. And I think one of the most promising things, and I'm currently trying to get a couple of efforts off the ground with the flood managed aquifer recharge, especially in the Central Valley, but this could really be true anywhere where where you have the capacity to reroute floodwaters in a way that you can recharge groundwater basins, even very small basins. So I think it's, the big dams and the big reservoirs actually start to become a bit of a liability if you have much larger storms, because you actually have to maintain really wide safety margins if you know that they're physically plausible. So, one way around that is the forecast informed reservoir operations is one way that you can come closer to the safety margin than you would be able to otherwise, because you can at least have some foreknowledge of, okay, there isn't going to be a big storm tomorrow, so tomorrow we don't have to release the water, but next week could be a different story. The other really promising approach, I think, is figuring out a way to retool the water infrastructure system so that you can reroute some of these big flood pulses that we know are going to happen periodically into places where they can actually do some good in the moment. And you can potentially couple this with flood risk reduction. I mean, we already kind of do this in the Central Valley with the YOLO bypass. That's not intended as a groundwater recharge solution. It's intended as a flood control solution. It's done a great job protecting Sacramento. You can imagine you have bypasses like that somewhere else where it is better suited to recharge, or if you actively move that water to somewhere where you pre-designate it as a recharge basin, then you could accomplish a lot of good by reducing the flood risk at the same time that you're reducing the future drought risk. So that, and I think local storage, are probably the two things that are maximally flexible in a way that makes the most sense given the physical science of what we expect to see.
Daniel, thank you. We have a couple more. Question from Shana in Oakland. Every time we have a drought, some people run out and buy kind of home rain barrels and hyper local storage of water. Is that really an effective strategy here in a climate that has a short rainy season like we have?
Yeah, I think it's less effective than it would be if we lived in a place where there was rainfall distributed throughout the year, because obviously you could definitely store some barrels in the winter, but that's only going to go so far. I mean, I'm not sure it's a bad idea. I just don't think it's maybe as effective as it could be in a different climate.
Is a gray follow-up? Is a gray water system maybe for the Bay Area? You would think a more effective solution?
It would certainly seem to be, based on the climate that we have. You're using water in the household all the time. It only rains for part of the year, so it would stand to reason that you'd have a more consistent reuse supply if you had a gray water versus a rainwater capture.
Yeah, thank you. We have time for one more. Amos White, Alameda, question?
Oh, yeah, thanks. I thought you were just going to read it. I don't even see it. Hold on, I have to see what my question was. Dan, most specifically, it had to do with trees and transevaporation and their contribution, not specific to local precipitation, but more so to the global system of atmospheric rivers, the atmospheric river system, as we're all seeking to do our part on climate restoration. So not looking for the direct impact here, but looking to the net effect. You most immediately spoke about the massive tree mortality rates here. It is alarming. Wildfires are actually putting big dents in that and accelerating it. But just due to die-offs that are occurring here, we have a great challenge ahead of us, and also in our urban areas. You said that California trees are not contributors to local precipitation, but I'd like to see how you would address the contribution. We have 9 million just street trees alone that are doing huge benefits as green infrastructure. But from a climate standpoint, how do they what is the net contribution to the global atmospheric river system? And what data do you think could be linked to that if you haven't pursued it? It sounded like you said you had not that it is, you see it as a potential link, but you haven't looked at it for its global effect, kind of like the butterfly effect. We plant more trees, we support our total tree canopy as a state, but we're not going to immediately benefit on the precipitation here, but it will contribute to the global atmospheric system in restoring climate, which then has the secondary effect of increasing our precipitation rates. How do you see that in terms of how we get back to normalcy?
Yeah, there's a lot in there. I mean, there are certain places on Earth. The main reason why California's trees don't directly affect its precipitation very much is because of the climate we have here, rather than the trees we have here. So in other parts of the world, you know, the climate that's intrinsic to a particular region can be quite sensitive to the local vegetation. It certainly is actually really for most of North America outside of California. California is kind of the exception. The tropical rainforests, as you might expect, are super important from a global climate perspective. The boreal forests and sort of the subarctic, those really extensive ones in the high latitudes, are also super important for moisture recycling and in those regions. I think that, you know, in terms of restoring California's climate, I think that the loss of trees, as bad as it is for other reasons, I don't think that it's so much sort of a cause effect type problem in California. It's more that the loss of trees is well, it's, you know, the loss of trees in the forest is really bad from an ecological perspective. And in urban areas, it's bad for the reasons you mentioned, because they provide so many services to where people actually live. And I think the more direct effect is probably with respect to temperature, because especially those urban trees, those urban forest canopies, hugely modulate how bad heat waves get, for example. So there are there are direct climate implications. It just doesn't have to do with precipitation as much in a place like California. But if you lose those street trees, that's bad news for the, you know, the increasing severity of heat waves. If you replant or if you introduce more greenery in urban areas, then that is a direct way of mitigating in urban areas specifically some of those heat-related impacts in a really important way.
Thanks.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, all of you, for your questions. The ones we didn't get to in the chat box, I will get them to Daniel via email, and maybe we can get you some good information back. Daniel is a fabulous academic because, as you can see, he's so involved in the practical work here and in what happens in the bigger world. So, Daniel, we thank you for your work at NCAR and at UCLA. And the Nature Conservancy, and I think we'll be calling on you, you know, in the months to come.
All right, I look forward to it.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Wonderful presentation. Okay, one more item, David. Daniel,
yes.
If you can stop sharing, then we'll start sharing the last item here.
Last item. Bear with us. Going to power through this really quickly, and we're going to end with a vote. You get to vote, so please stick with it right till 12. Climate Science Services is a program that we're rolling out for next year. This is something, as I mentioned at the outset, Bruce and I have been talking about for a number of years. I think the last presentation highlights that science is an extremely important part of the adaptation challenge. In many ways, it starts the adaptation challenge, but it also never goes away because it's constantly changing. Our understanding, our observations, our modeling of the future, and of course our greenhouse gas emissions, which determines it. Climate Services is the place where science meets planning. And it's often construed as a thing or an item. So climate services mean data or information or a website. And that's not what it is. It's actually a process. And this definition, among the many definitions of climate services you can find on the internet, does the best job, in my opinion, of explaining the climate services is a process more than a product. It is the provision of climate information to assist decision-making. It responds to user needs. It's, of course, based on credible, sound science and requires appropriate engagement between users and providers. Users are us, providers are the climate science community, roughly defined. Next slide. This is a conversation that's been going on for a very long time. At a federal level, there was a 2-year process in the first 2 years of the Obama administration, when Democrats controlled Congress, by the way, that included bills and folks like Jane Lubchenco was the head of NOAA at the time, saying that we need to establish a climate information service that's modeled on the National Weather Service, but of course, taking things on a climate basis. Long story short, those efforts failed. It's not that there aren't climate service operations in the country, there are, but the effort to kind of stitch them together and build a hub and spokes dynamic that delivers information to adaptation planners in the post-2009 era failed in Congress. Next slide, it's coming back now. This is an article from The Hill magazine by Richard Moss and Kathy Jacobs, who many of you may know, that says that we're now going to be outpacing our climate service available without federal action in terms of dealing with the risks. We need to have, right now what we have is a poorly funded and uncoordinated system of climate services that's totally inadequate to meet the nation's needs. Talks about how that's important for equitable adaptation planning and just for adaptation planning in general as well. So we're going to address that not at a national level, not at a state level, though those are levels that are very important. We're going to try to take that on in a piloting kind of way within Baycan and a Bay Area setting. Next slide, Bruce. So what the kind of questions we're going to try to answer through what we're going to roll out over the next few months, and I'll talk about how we're going to do that next, is what is best available actionable science today? What are the key uncertainties that are important to understand when thinking about planning? What are the strengths and weaknesses of the dizzying array of tools that are available? I think we've all seen there's a website in every corner and a database everywhere. And the more time goes on, the more downscaling techniques and tools are available to us. What are their strengths and weaknesses? What kind of comparisons have been done between them for different purposes? Of course, observations, modeling, and science itself and projections are changing over time. How have they changed? Those of you who are in climate get inquiries all the time when there's an article in the newspaper that says we have new observations in Antarctica or wherever, and there's what does this mean for us? And sometimes it's very meaningful, sometimes it's preliminarily meaningful, sometimes it's not meaningful. What do these new information as it emerges over time mean? What progress have we made in understanding the toughest but most impactful future conditions to predict? As we were just talking about with Daniel, extreme events. Sounds like there's some progress in his shop. We've seen other folks within the Baycan family have been talking about extreme events and how we're dealing with it on a water supply and water management perspective. And then what progress have we made in acting under uncertainty? Climate services is not just about science, it's also can be about decision-making under the uncertainty, particularly for long-term climate impacts that relates to that science. And how are we addressing that uncertainty while also, planning ahead for our resilience in the long-term future? So this is the program again, and you can see the Climate Science Services program in the middle there. Let's talk about how we're going to do it. First thing we're going to do is some workshops. And we're going to bring together Baycan members who are interested with partners at UC Berkeley and others to put together a workshop, not something huge, relatively small, relatively low key, to kind of brainstorm what a climate science service program that we might put together at Baycan and pilot an approach related to, for the benefit of our members, might look like. What would it do? How would it proceed? What kind of experts can we draw upon? Because those are obviously really important, both the scientists and the boundary organization folks who specialize in science translation. Identify the specific needs that we have. I mean, some areas of information may be really well understood, but others may not be. And this is through Bruce finding some funding at Berkeley through the RISER program that can provide for some time to put these things together in addition to the resources that Baycan bring to the table. So big props to Bruce for finding this and making this available within the Baycan framework. That'll be for a couple of workshops. June and July is what we're hoping to be able to pull off. Not really large, but we do want to hear those who are interested in engaging and participating. At the same time, we will convene some internal conversations that we've started already on some issues of interest, particularly extreme events within Baycan members who are interested in kind of piloting this initial service project in a way that can, get us some experience under our belt. This is not always a well understood thing, but it can be very profitable. It goes on all over the country and all over the world, actually, where there are resources devoted to this. Those of you who know about the RISA program in the United States, the Climate Service Center in Germany, Oranos in Canada, these entities have a track record of doing this well. We're going to draw on that expertise, that literature, that experience, and do something at our own level here in the Bay Area. So that's the plan. We want to get some feedback in our last 4 minutes on what kind of issues might you be most interested in from the 50 plus folks that are still left with us here. So we're going to do a quick poll. We're going to ask you to pick 2 of these. If the thing you're most interested in is not here, send a chat. But let's do a quick poll where everyone picks 2 subjects that they would be most likely to be interested in discussing with our experts or hearing from our experts about from your own perch. So Bruce, why don't you launch the poll?
Vote for 2.
Vote for 2.
And as David said, if you want to vote for something you don't see here or make a
Wait a minute, don't go away.
use the chat box. We're not going. We're still here.
So could I say something?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think this question of climate services and environmental and climate justice is a really key issue. That the fact that we have such a large percentage of our population scattered out all over the place, but also is not necessarily being tuned into the climate science, having some way of measuring the availability of science and interpretation as it impacts those who are least available, have least availability would be a good subject matter.
I agree 100%, Carl. That is one of the elements that we've talked about within the Bay Adapt process, that we've talked about as we're thinking about this, is engagement. Climate services is significantly about engagement. It's about education. It's about getting feedback. It actually starts from the practitioner perspective. It starts from the community perspective, if you will. That's one of the distinguishing features of climate services done well. It's not, here's the science, go use it. It's what are your questions? What are your issues? What are the problems you're dealing with? And how can science actually meet those needs? So I think that's a really important part of the dynamic that we're going to explore.
Thank you.
Any other questions while we're wrapping up the poll? We're going to end right at 12.
And David, we've got 45 out of the 52 people or 52 present have voted. So, and it's been at that number for a few minutes or for a
All
minute.
right.
So
and let's see what we got.
Maybe give it another 30 seconds.
30 seconds.
Finish up.
So y'all should have my email address, Bruce's email address. If you're interested in engaging in the planning, let us know. If you're interested in engaging through participation, let us know. We'll be reaching out to you as well. I promise to get as many engaged as possible. But anyone who knows they're interested should communicate with us. You can do it in the chat here because we saved the chat, right, Bruce?
Yeah.
But emails as well.
Okay, I'm going to end the poll and share the results. Can you all see the results here?
Yep.
So extreme precip 26%, sea level rise 36%, storm surge 13, heat waves 26, wildfire and smoke number 1 at 43%, ecosystems in all 23, and water supply and drought at 38.
So basically everything, pretty much.
Well, you asked.
And Jessica raised a question in the chat. How do we pay for this? That's a fair question. Right now, your member dues will pay for this, plus Bruce finding some resources for his time will pay for this. In the long run, we need to find sustainable funding. That's been really, really difficult. The RESA program at the US government level run by NOAA has been around for 30 years, I think. And its funding has been remarkably flat for the majority of that time. And inadequate, as Moss and Jacobs wrote in the Hill piece I showed, when looking at demand. So that is one of the problems we have to address. At the state level, the interest in hiring people to do this work has been low. At the federal level, to an extent, that's been the case as well. But if we can show how the benefits to the adaptation enterprise exist and are there, let's think that those barriers to sustainability will fall away.
David, it's noon and the floor.
Guess we have to stop. Thank you all so much for sticking with us. It was great attendance. I hope the meeting was enjoyable for everybody. Seemed fairly diverse, and you'll hear from us soon.
Jack has his hand up. There
Jack
you're on
is
mute.
clapping.
Oh, okay, he's just clapping.
And if you any questions on your invoices, let us know. And any new members that you want to help us recruit, please communicate with us about that. We're very interested in doing that, of course. Thank you, everybody.
Be well, everyone.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, David. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.